Good evening, everybody, and good Shabbat. Welcome to the sacrament of Shabbat. Today, we continue our discussion of the book of Isaiah. This is part 28 of a series where we continue with a discussion on Isaiah chapter 32. So, this again is a chapter about the eventual fall of Israel to the Babylonian Empire, where the first temple will be destroyed, Jerusalem will be sacked, and most, if not all, Jews will be put into exile in the Babylonian Empire. According to Isaiah in earlier chapters, and we've discussed this many times, God allows the Jewish people to be thrown out of Jerusalem and for their temple to be destroyed because they were not faithful to the way of God. They were not doing in thought, word, and deed the Torah. So, according to Isaiah, this gave God, Yahweh, permission to use foreign militaries as instruments of destruction, not only of Israel's enemies, but Israel itself. That this was a way of purifying. If you weren't with God, then you were kind of against God in a military kind of way. So the idea here is that if you did not make yourself right with God, if you did not make a return to the way of God, then there would be devastating consequences for you. For example, in chapter 32, we're about to cover it, harvests would fail. That's one of many different things. When you did not comply with the commandments of God, it was believed that you would become sick and die. The wages of sin is death, as Paul said. So harvests would fail. Military campaigns would fail if you weren't in line with God. So it was very important from an everyday survival perspective in ancient Israel to be right with God. Because if you were right with God, if you obeyed the way of God as outlined in Torah, then you were protected by God. And you are provided for by God. So it's the belief of Isaiah that if you did not do Torah actively in thought, word, and deed, that God would kind of abandon you. And that's what it was here. But of course, he also says that if you make a return to the way of God, if you start embodying thought, word, and deed the Torah and doing the commandments of God therein, that there would in essence be a forgiveness and that you would come back to it. So there is an idea of a restoration of Israel, both as individual Israelites being restored or making a return, teshuvah, back to the way of God, but also Israel as a nation being restored politically and religiously, because they were about to lose their whole way of life. They're about to lose their country, lose their temple, and be exiled into the Babylonian Empire. So Isaiah 32:1 says, "See, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule with justice." Many people see this as some kind of foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. I'm a bishop with apostolic succession. I love Jesus. I teach about Jesus all the time, all week long, and on Sundays especially. Isaiah did not predict Jesus is coming, and this is not about Jesus is coming either. Many Christian sects will teach it this way, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Prophets prophesied for the people of their time, not for a people 2,000 years from now. The idea of a prophet was that they saw that some people had wandered away from the way of God, and their job was to encourage people to make a return to God. And sometimes before they made a return to the way of God and had faith that there was a living God that they couldn't see, but that was intimately involved in the affairs of life of Israel and the world at large, prophets would make a prophecy of something that would come to fruition during their lifetimes so that they would know the prophet knew what the heck he was talking about. And then they'd say, hey, that prophet of God said this would happen. And I'm seeing it now in my lifetime. So I'm going to make a return to the way of God because God has just shown to this prophet that he is with us. And now I want to be with him. That's the idea of a prophet. So no prophet, including the prophet Isaiah, prophesied Jesus coming 1,000 or some years later, right? It just isn't what they did. So very few biblical scholars think that this is about Jesus. And in fact, it's not. It's about King Hezekiah, seen here to the left in this beautiful image. King Hezekiah was of the lineage of King David of Hebrew Testament fame. And much like David, Hezekiah was not perfect. He was not some sainted being, but he really did make reformation of the temple, and he really did make reformation and help to rebuild Israel once the Persian emperor Cyrus the Great, he let the Jews go back after he conquered the Persian Empire, conquered the Babylonian Empire. And then Cyrus the Great, who was much more broad-minded, allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their home and a second temple. So Hezekiah did help with this transition. So he helped to restore Israel to some extent. He was very successful. And he was much more successful than his predecessor, King Ahaz, who is also of Davidic lineage. So here, we are not talking about Jesus Christ. We are talking about the coming of King Hezekiah. In Barnes's notes in the Bible, seen here to the right, behold a king, that is Hezekiah. That it refers to him as apparent from the connection. The reign of Ahaz had been one of oppression and idolatry. This was to be succeeded by the reign of one under whom the rights of the people would be secured and under whom there would be a state of general prosperity. This may have been uttered while Ahaz was on the throne, or it may have been when Hezekiah began to reign. Perhaps the latter is the more probable, as Ahaz might not have tolerated anything that would have looked like a reflection on his own reign. Nor perhaps, while he was on the throne, would Isaiah have given a description that would have been a contrast between his reign and that of his successor. Shall reign in righteousness, that is, a righteous king, one that is right with God, shall reign, and his administration shall be one of justice and strongly in contrast with that of his predecessor. This was certainly the general characteristic of the reign of Hezekiah. So here Isaiah is saying that we don't know if this is true. Barnes is only guessing whether Hezekiah was prophesying Hezekiah coming during the reign of Ahaz. It was introduced in the very first verse of chapter 1 of the book of Isaiah, somewhere around there. Some were pretty close. So King Ahaz had many problems, and he did not rule everything quite so well. And God let Jerusalem get the sack because of it ultimately. So the idea here is that if Isaiah was saying this freely in public when Ahaz was able to hear it, he might have been arrested or detained or sternly corrected. Because there was often a very big division between prophets. Prophets often had their own way of thinking, which was separate from royalty that had more connections with the temple. Temple worship and what prophets often did were two different things. Temple worship often involved animal sacrifice, sometimes plant sacrifices, meaning vegetation, during different Jewish festivals in the circle of festivals of the year. But mostly prophets celebrated a meal of bread and wine, symbolizing that we do in our Seder, our holy Seder that we do each week prior to this talk. The wine representing the bliss, the ecstasy of the Olam Haba, the world to come, or the world that is in the stages of becoming. And the bread represents God's abundance, God's providence, God's prosperity in our lives. It represents his teaching that we should digest and assimilate into our lives. And for us in our tradition, in our apostolic succession, the bread during the Seder also is reminiscent or as commemorative of the Messianic marriage banquet, in which we strive to purify our hearts and expand our consciousness so that our individual souls may marry or merge with the communion of saints, the Bar Anash, the Son of Man collective Messiah, of which Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, was firstborn. So here, it's very important to know that it was common, just to give a contrast to Barnes's notes in the Bible seen here, that prophets were often at odds with royalty. So I think it's quite possible that he made this prophecy while Ahaz was still on the throne. And of course, he wouldn't do it right in his royal court. He would do it somewhere with his disciples or those that were hearers. So the prophets often got in trouble. I mean, Jesus said, we have to be careful because you know how it all ended for the prophets. They were all put to death or stoned or some other kind of thing. So it's very important to know that prophets were often at odds with kings. So uh, it's quite possible that there was a criticism of Ahaz while Ahaz was still on the throne by Isaiah. So eyes will see, ears will hear due to this king, King Hezekiah. Isaiah 32:3. Then the eyes of those who have sight will not be closed, and the ears of those who have hearing will listen. So Hezekiah brought about what we can call a partial restoration of Israel, because he did manage to take throne in Jerusalem. He did help to facilitate the rebuilding of a temple. He brought together Israel on a political level, brought back its sovereignty to some degree, and also he helped to establish the religion again by being allowed by Cyrus the Great to build a temple and to reestablish religion and do their own thing within reason of Cyrus the Great's eyes and ears. So the results of not having fidelity with God is quite harsh. Isaiah 32:9-11. Isaiah prophesies to the women that are hearing him in some crowd somewhere. Rise up, you women who are at ease. Hear my voice, you complacent daughters. Listen to my speech. In little more than a year, you will shudder, you complacent ones, for the vintage will fail, the fruit harvest will not come. Tremble, you women who are at ease, shudder, you complacent ones. Strip and make yourselves bare, and put sackcloth on your loins. So here it's apparent that Isaiah feels that the women are complacent. They're not really concerned about the fact that the people of Israel, their children, their husbands, maybe their family members are falling away from the way of God. So he's saying, hey, start praying, start encouraging your children and your husbands to come back to the way of God. Because if not, in little more than a year, your harvest is going to fail, which means you're going to go hungry. Your vintage will fail. There won't be enough grapes or whatever kind of fruit that they use to create wine. So he said, you'd better strip yourselves bare and put sackcloth on your loins. And when you wore sackcloth in ancient Judaism, that was a sign of grieving. It was a sign of death. So whenever somebody died or was very sick and on the verge of death, you would wear sackcloth to grieve the death of somebody. So what Isaiah was effectively saying here is put on sackcloth because Israel is dying here. This your country, the temple is going to be destroyed. Jerusalem, the capital, is going to be burnt to the ground, and everybody's going to lose their ability to be free. Essentially, you're going to become exiles within the Babylonian Empire. So put on sackcloth because you're grieving the death of your freedom, of your country, of your religion, of your temple. There's a lot of death and loss that's about to happen. So start the funeral procession now, is essentially what Isaiah was saying. So the Davidic king helps to restore Israel. Isaiah 32:14-18. For the palace will be forsaken, the populous city deserted, the hill and the watchtower will become dens forever. The joy of wild asses, a pasture for flocks, until a spirit from on high is poured out on us, and the wilderness becomes a fruitful field, and the fruitful field is deemed a forest. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness will abide in the fruitful field. The effect of righteousness will be peace, the result of righteousness, quietness, and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. So Isaiah is speaking on behalf of Yahweh here. He's speaking as a prophet. And he's saying that, yes, the time will come. The palace where the Davidic king sits will be forsaken. The populous city of Jerusalem will be abandoned. It'll be a ghost town. The hill and the watchtower where the guards watch for enemies to come closer will become dens forever. And it's just a place where not a human will be. but it'll be the joy of wild asses just wandering through the leveled city of Jerusalem, a pasture for flocks of different animals just roaming about. You can imagine like the wild, wild west with the tumbleweed going across the abandoned city. And that's the imagery that we get. And it will remain this way because of those who are unfaithful to the way of God. Jews that were unfaithful to the way of God. This is what Isaiah has expressed over and over again, whether we agree with it or not, whether it sounds logical to us or not, whether it sounds like a God that has a heart or not. We have to be free to think and ask these things. Did God actually do this? Or are we just coming up with an explanation of why bad things happen to good people? There had to be an explanation. If God was the God of Israel, he was not only the God of Israel, Isaiah said, but the God of all nations. So if the God of all nations was the God of Israel in particular, and the Jews were the chosen people, how could that city fall? How could their temple fall? Isaiah had to come up with a reason for that. And the reason was God is all powerful and he let that city fall because there are way too many of us that just aren't following the way. That is the logic behind all of the book of Isaiah from chapters 1 through, I believe, 40. And then the tone changes more, but not that much. So the idea here is that Jerusalem is left desolate until a spirit from on high is poured out on us, until God's grace comes. And that wilderness, the abandoned Jerusalem, becomes a fruitful field with people and businesses and food and all the workings of a major city, right? And then justice will dwell in the wilderness and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. The effect of righteousness will be peace. The effect of returning to the way of God, of making teshuvah, those people that returned to God that had fallen away, plus the holy remnant that was always faithful, when those righteous people come together, then there'll be peace. God's temper calms down. The result of righteousness or being right with God, doing the way of Torah, is quietness and trust forever. My people will therefore be given a gift. They'll have a peaceful habitation. They will have secure dwellings, so that this will never happen again. And yes, it did happen again many times. And in quiet resting places. The Babylonians weren't the last people to afflict the Jews, right? You had the Roman Empire. You had Hitler and the Nazis. You have a lot of white superior people in the United States that are making up stories about Jewish people, and Donald Trump saying that, hey, if Jews don't vote for me, then you're stupid, right? What is that nonsense? So Jews are still being accosted this day. Right now, as we speak, the war between Israel and Hamas is going on. Whatever we say about Israel's leadership, their governmental leadership, that is, Hamas did attack them, tried to destroy them, wants to get rid of them, wipe them off the face of the earth. Their manifestos say this. So right now, it's not false to say that the Jews are fighting for their existence as they always have. So let us pray that all the Jewish people, especially those that are in Israel, are safe, and that anti-Semitism and all this kind of nonsense in the world is quelled and eliminated for good. And let's not scapegoat God. Yes, we should be obedient to God. Why? Because we love God. Why? Because we want to be intimate with God. We want to have oneness with God's consciousness. We want to live in his joy, in his peace, in his light, in his wisdom. But let's not demonize God and say he's letting it happen. It's humans that let this crap happen. Since the time of Isaiah until right now, this moment, this second, somewhere in Israel and in Gaza, Israel people are dying. People in the Middle East of all religions and all backgrounds are dying because of the nonsense of humans. Let's not say that God is allowing it to happen. We have to remember every man or woman of God has differing levels of inspiration. I'm not saying I'm better than Hezekiah. I'm not saying Hezekiah wasn't a great prophet. I'm not saying that he wasn't motivated to say things for a certain reason. He had to energize the people of his time to do something. Maybe he was very clever, but I don't accept scapegoating God and saying God did it. You want to know who's responsible for bad human behavior? Humans. Immature, selfish, greedy, power hungry humans, not God. That's my rant. Good Shabbat. Let's have the second cup of blessing, and I'll do the same thing next week, probably. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother of the universe, as Saint Francis of Assisi said, let me be an instrument of your peace. Let me not blame you when things go wrong, but let me find the fault in myself, in my communication, in my thoughts, and in my deeds, and help me to correct myself. Help me to reason, help me to use my logic, and help me to blend that well with the feeling of the heart and intuition of the soul. Amen. Good Shabbos, everybody. I'll see you next Friday evening, God willing.